the real behind the scenes story of Oculus, Facebook, and VR headsets. I'm Tonya Hall, and joining me is Blake J. Harris, writer, filmmaker, and author of The History of the Future, Oculus, Facebook, and the Revolution That Swept Virtual Reality. Welcome, Blake.
Tonya, thank you so much for having me on. I feel like I haven't left my home or spoken to anyone in 4 or 5 years working on this book, but last time I was out in the world, we talked about console wars. So thank you so much for having me on to talk about the new book.
Absolutely. Console Wars was actually is on the shelf behind me because I'm such a big fan of your work, and as are many in the world, especially in the tech space. Tell us about some of your writing and filmmaking accomplishments, including the making of Console Wars.
Sure. So I'm 36 years old. For every day of my adult life post-college from 22 to 30, I had a day job trading commodities for Brazilian clients, selling sugar and coffee and soybeans. So I was not writing, or I was writing on the side and hoping to do this full time. I was basically a failed screenwriter, and so failed that I have still to this day never sold any scripts. But I was successful enough to get good representation. And so around 2010, 2011, when I had the idea to write Console Wars, which was really inspired by the idea to read a book like Console Wars and then being surprised that no such book existed, just a behind the scenes business story about the video game industry, particularly that era. I ended up selling the book to HarperCollins and selling the film rights to Seth Rogen and Sony, which was life-changing for me. The film project has now evolved into a television series with Legendary Pictures, and knock on wood, that'll hopefully soon we'll know which distributor is going to be making the show, and we have a great pilot script. And so these past 5 or 6 years have been completely different for me, getting to write full time and getting to go behind the scenes in the video game industry. And as with everything I write, both of these 2 books were, my goal was always to think of my grandmother and how I can write a tech story that still would be appealing to her. And the secret to me always seems to be characters, telling character-driven stories. And I think that, if nothing else, this book demonstrates a strong level of access and several years spent working on it. And I really hope that it brings to life these very interesting characters.
I want to get into the access you had that later. First, I want to find out. So the book, you just talked about your new book, History of the Future, and it is a compelling story. What was it that made you decide that this is the story that you wanted to tell? This is the book that you wanted to write?
That's a great question, because for a while I didn't know. And for a while, I was so fortunate that my first book was a story that was about 2 companies that were so beloved, and also about characters and people I interviewed that were so nice, quite frankly, and so generous with their time. And I mentioned that because the first idea I had for another book was the early years of Electronic Arts. And I'll just say that some of the people who worked there were kind of frosty. And even if I got the access, I realized I didn't want to spend years writing about these people who, frankly, I just didn't want to talk to a lot. And then around that time, because for me, Console Wars was such a big deal. It was the first time that anyone was writing about me, interviewing me. A very big deal in the Harris family with my parents was that I was in an issue of Popular Mechanics. And so during a Mother's Day brunch in 2014, in May 2014, I went to the bodega to go get this issue that had just come out, hit the newsstands. And on my way back to the brunch, I was really captivated by the cover story, which featured a 21-year-old kid named Palmer Luckey, and talked about the founding of Oculus and virtual reality. And I had heard about Oculus, but I didn't really know that there was this meaty story to it and such fascinating characters. And but I still was looking at other stories. The book I was maybe thinking of writing was about Rovio, the creator of Angry Birds, and really using that as a way to explore mobile gaming and how it's changed so much. Basically how it has changed gaming so much over the past 10 years. But I remember being at either Comic-Con or E3 in 2014, and I was having lunch with Tom Kalinske and Al Nilsson from Console Wars. They're very nice guys and also good advice givers. And so I was talking to them, this sort of trying to answer the same question you asked me, what should the next book be? And what am I going to devote my years to? And I suggested Rovio, and Tom and Al said, oh, no, you can do better than that. And I said, well, you guys, it's like this multi-billion-dollar company. It's the biggest mobile game. And they said, I don't know. And I said, all right, well, I've also been kind of looking into Oculus. and virtual reality. They said, oh, do that. And I then wanted to do it, but it took me, I think, a year and a half from that point to get the access that I wanted. And then starting in February of 2016, I was given essentially unlimited access by Facebook, who had acquired Oculus, and Oculus to speak with their employees and to go behind the scenes to tell the story. That access ended up being revoked 2 years later due to some of the incidents in the book and them not wanting me to report on it. But it was a very interesting process writing this one. Took way longer than expected. The dedication at the front of the book is to my wife and says, thanks for standing by me as a 1-year project. It became 3. I spent a long time digging into this one. The most obvious change while writing it, the book, this book was happening while I was writing it versus Console Wars, which was 20 years ago. And one of the main characters, if not the main character, Palmer Luckey, the founder of Oculus, got fired in the middle of the book, and got fired in such a way that Facebook didn't even admit that he was fired, and he just exited the company. So there's a lot of mystery there, and the book became about a lot of different things. But I do believe that it will probably be the most important thing I ever write in my life, just because it's about Facebook, and I'm glad that we're having these cultural discussions now about the role of Facebook in our lives, in our country, in our democracy, and what that would mean for virtual reality.
I first off, I have to say, I don't think this is going to be the most important thing that you've written, because I expect a lot of great work from you in the future. That said, it is a really important story. And I want to talk specifically next about Palmer Luckey and the Oculus inventor and his story, which is what made this so interesting and how Facebook handled it. Talk a little bit about Palmer.
Sure. So the book begins in 2012, in April 2012, on a sunny afternoon in Long Beach, California, where at that point in time, Palmer Luckey was then 19 years old and living in a 19-foot camper trailer in the driveway of his parents' dual family, a home that they shared with another family. And the way that I described the trailer that he was living in was like the meth van in Breaking Bad, but with virtual reality headsets instead of drugs. I remember asking Palmer if that sounded about right after he had spent some time describing it to me. He said, yeah, no, that's pretty much it. So it's sort of this mad scientist laboratory. And, in 2012, he was one of only, less than 100 people in the world who cared about virtual reality. Forget for a moment his genius and his skills as an entrepreneur, but just the fact that he was one of the people working on it is a large reason why he was successful, why Oculus was successful. On this fateful April day, he receives a message from John Carmack, the legendary game developer, best known for id software games like Doom and Wolfenstein, and now he's at Oculus. And, he basically discovered Palmer, or, became aware of his work and saw that what Palmer was doing was much more affordable and much more immersive than what the big companies were doing, like Sony or Imagine, and these headsets that cost $1,000 or tens of thousands of dollars that, for a few $100s, Palmer was creating something that was better. And so to me, as much as this is a book about virtual reality, it always was just sort of an American dream story, a kid with an idea, trying to build a company. And for better or worse, the book swerves into a lot of other territories, like politics and online mobs and all this stuff. But at the same time, I do think that is part of the modern day American dream or American tale story, because that is such a big part of where our online discourse and cultural discourse is at.
You mentioned a few seconds ago, earlier in the interview, about the number of people that you interviewed and how things unfolded exactly. In fact, you interviewed over 100 people while researching the book. When did you realize that there was more to the story than you were actually being told?
That's a really good question. So, like I said, it's all about character to me. So building these relationships is what makes the book successful, in my opinion. And, the book took 3.5 years, and a lot of that's because the story changed and because of the research, but it also just is about building a rapport with someone over a few years stretch of time. And so in March of 2017, Palmer Luckey exited the company. That was the official wording. They didn't say whether he was fired or whether he chose to leave. I had been in touch with him, and though there was a lot of things he couldn't talk to me about, I knew he did not want to go. And so to answer your question of when did I start to suspect there was more to the story, it's when about a year after that, and I was getting to this point in the book of really dealing with his exit, I made clear to the people at Facebook and at Oculus, the executives that I was speaking with, that I had a pretty good relationship with, that I was concerned about writing this portion of the book, that, Palmer was a main character and his exit was important. I couldn't just not describe it, and I needed more information. They started to open up about it, and I began to realize that they were not being truthful with me. The most obvious example is just that they said it was Palmer's choice to leave, when I knew for sure that it wasn't. And then that's also where the relationships that I had really came into play, because eventually things came to a head. Facebook pulled my access and instructed all their employees to stop speaking with me. But I had built these strong relationships. I was in touch every few days with several of these people. And after hearing the lies that Facebook was hoping that I would launder into putting out there, a lot of people really stepped up to the plate, people from both sides of the political spectrum, because this did become a politically charged story. Palmer is a Trump supporter. That was not very popular at Facebook. I'll say for the record, and I have said several times, that I am very much not a Trump supporter, but what happened to him was really unfair and also illegal in California. And I got a lot of help from people who still worked at the company to get me the information I needed. And that was another big difference too with this book and Console Wars, was because of how the story changed, people's narratives and explanations began changing to me. And so I had to rely even more on archival records. With Console Wars, email didn't really exist or wasn't really being used, whereas now, whether people were misremembering because it was a couple of years ago or because they had their own agenda, I always defaulted to archival records and text message conversations, and that really made this book take longer to research, but also gave me the certainty I needed to report some of the things that I found very troubling.
So I want to talk about the impression that Facebook has. So let's just say many VR executives and engineers tell me that the next Oculus headset is going to be the game changer for the industry, but Facebook hasn't exactly endeared itself in the general public lately with all that's happened. How might the negative attention of Facebook impact the adoption of Quest?
I mean, it's something I think about all the time. I did, fortunately, your audience is pretty savvy in this area. So they know that virtual reality, or just, an AR, VR headset, is a much more intimate technology than anything we've ever experienced in our personal lives, more so than a laptop or a smartphone. It's tracking your eye movements eventually. It has cameras in your home. There's sensors everywhere. So all that is necessary for a great VR experience, but all that in the wrong hands or with a company that doesn't handle your data well is really concerning. And I remember being asked at a book signing a couple months ago by someone who said what you just said, that Oculus Quest seems like a game changer. It seems affordable if the guy saved up for enough months, and it seemed totally worth it technologically. But he didn't like Facebook, he didn't trust Facebook, and he asked me if he should buy it. And I said, I don't know. And I really don't know. As a VR geek, I'm so happy and excited for Quest. But as a person who's really disgusted by what I learned about Facebook and don't think that they seem to have changed in any way, nor do I think they really have an incentive to change, I'm very concerned. I guess the best case is that it will, at least bring a lot of attention to VR and hopefully bring other competitors to the market, and they'll be able to offer something similar to the Quest. Or maybe Facebook will find a way to earn back public trust. Thus far, I've not been impressed with what they've said publicly and what I hear going on behind the scenes. But people can change, companies can change, and I did always, no matter I have complicated feelings about Facebook, but I do genuinely appreciate that in addition to the near $3 billion that they spent on Oculus, they have put their money where their mouth is. They have invested billions of dollars on virtual reality. And again, as a VR geek, I love that part of it.
You've been in the lion's den as you wrote this book. You've been interviewed many times, in fact, and I guess, what don't we know yet about your experience, or is there something that you uncovered while you were writing the book that maybe we don't know yet?
Sure. So about my experience, it was a long experience. It was very difficult, this one, dealing with people who were not truthful to me and whose stories changed and who started not getting along with each other. And so their versions of events changed. But then in the middle of all that, my wife's mother passed away, my mother-in-law, and we went out to St. Louis for a month, and that probably turned out to be a really good, reflecting. Like it was so devastating to lose my mother-in-law, and but we went out there, and one of the things that we inherited from her was her cat, Itchy, who's an 11-year-old wonderful cat. He's kept me company through my writing, and it's interesting. I joked to my wife that I should open this new book by saying, like, dear readers, I don't want to mislead you that while writing Console Wars, I was a dog person, but now I'm a cat person. All my life, I didn't like cats, mostly because I was allergic to them, but for some reason, I'm not allergic to Itchy. And he's definitely added a necessary tranquility to my life. In terms of the actual stuff I've uncovered, there was, in addition to the hundreds of interviews, I did end up getting, over 25,000 documents that I went through. So there's so much stuff that I want to figure out other ways to get out. But I'll just relay a conversation I had that really stuck with me, which might be insignificant in the scheme of things, in the grand scheme of things, but it did feel significant to me. I was talking with Andrew Bosworth, who's now the head of AR and VR for Facebook, and he used to be the head of ads. And this was before we even really got into the interview. We were just chatting, and we were both talking about how much fake news and misinformation bothered both of us as a journalist and as a guy with a platform. And so I threw out an idea to him, and I said, hey, here's an idea I had. What about if when someone shares an article on Facebook, there's a little clock that says how much time they spent reading it? So, because I think a lot of people just share headlines, don't actually read the articles. At least you would know that, or that people would probably be deterred from doing that. I think this is a good idea. I'm totally open to the idea that people think it's a terrible idea, or that it's an invasion of privacy anyway, the point was, his response was that was already part of the algorithm. And as we continue talking, what I came to realize was that Facebook believes that they know best. Instead of giving users the power to say, all right, this is a feature that I want to make this decision. I actually care. That's the number one factor to me, is how long did Tonya spend reading this before she shared it with me? They just build that into the algorithm in the way that they believe works best, a way that could financially benefit them the most, or maybe actually increase engagement. We don't know what that black box reveals, but it seems to me very indicative of a lot of what happens, where they just think they know better than their users, and they're very smart people, but they're also, they're very stubborn people, and seem to operate with a lot of hubris that I think would be wise for them to reconsider.
Wow, that's interesting. I could talk about that further, and we should at some point. But I also want to just basically say Palmer Luckey's story is a $2 billion 21st century rags to riches tale. But knowing the details like you do, and you have so many, as you pointed out, all the back end story, what advice or caution would you offer to today's 19-year-old inventors working feverishly in their garage for the next big thing?
Ooh, that's such a great question, because I've never thought about that before, but I guess in the back of my mind, that was something I was always sort of dealing with. The first thing I would say is that passion is everything. I remember speaking with my editor early on, and she asked why I thought that Palmer and Oculus were the heroes, why they should be the heroes of the story, the central protagonist point of view. And I said, because whether Palmer made $2 billion with this or $2 with this, he still would have done it because he loved this. He wasn't doing it to try to cash out. And maybe that just appeals to me as a writer who, decided to spend 4 years on a project instead of 1 year, and, really follow his passion. The other thing too, is I would say that it's an ensemble effort, no matter what you do, whether it's writing a book, whether it's building a virtual reality headset, whether it's the next big thing. Palmer was the one who was on the cover of Wired and Time and Popular Mechanics, but that wouldn't have happened without people like Brendan Arib, the CEO, Nate Mitchell, Mike Antonoff, and so many other people. And he'd be the first to admit that. But you don't always get that sense when you just look at Time magazine and you see Palmer. You think Palmer did this. And then the last thing I would say, though, is a really good question. So if anyone has any, is looking for advice afterwards, I'm happy to impart what I've learned. But the last thing I would say is not just from Palmer and from the people at Oculus, but throughout the course of my research, I did speak with a lot of other people in Silicon Valley, several of whom had been fortunate enough and successful enough to sell companies. And I would suggest to any entrepreneur who's in that fortunate position where someone wants to buy what you've created, to just know that you're selling your company and what that means. The book opens with a quote from Mad Men, where Peggy Olson tells Don Draper, "You never say thank you," and he says that's what the money is for. And to me, that was the personification of Silicon Valley. It's very transactional. And, once Facebook has acquired your company, they, in their mind, owe you nothing. And to some degree, that's accurate, but a lot of times when founders stay on or early employees stay on, they think that they're going to continue to have the control and to have it be their vision that's executed. And for understandable reasons, that's not the case. But since it is your baby, and since this is something that's so personal to people, it is really hard to wrap your head around that. So I would just be very careful about making sure you sell to the person you believe will be the right buyer, and also to talk to a lot of other people who have been in your position if you're able to do so.
Great advice. Blake J. Harris, writer, filmmaker, and author of The History of the Future. If somebody wants that advice from you, maybe they want to find out more or even get a copy of your book, how can they do that, Blake?
I'm very easy or very responsive on Twitter at Blake J. Harris NYC. I really am so grateful to be doing what I love every day. So I love interacting with people, and I feel like a great honor to be the custodian for the story of Sega and now for Oculus. So if you have any questions, I will almost definitely respond to you at Blake J. Harris NYC on Twitter. And my website is blakejharris.com, which has excerpts from the book. So if you're interested and just want to know what it's all about, there's some stuff there. There's also links where you can buy the book. There's also links to other work that I've done about terrible movies and how terrible movies are made. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's been great talking to you.
Absolutely. And if you guys want to find me and connect with me, you can do that at tonyahall.net. Thanks for watching.